It's one of the most beautiful groups of islands in the Pacific. The variety of the marine life here is one of the greatest in the world. Palau consists of 200 islands and supports one of the most complex and delicate ecosystems in the world. Marine biologists are still cataloguing the plants and animals, many of which are unique to the islands. The archipelago is perhaps best known as part of the Pacific battleground of World War II. Fortunately, the war did little to harm the natural wonders of what might justly be called the Sea of Eden. The Palau archipelago lies 800 kilometers southeast of the Philippines and 3,200 kilometers south of Japan. An expedition led by underwater cameraman Al Giddings went to Palau to film this Pacific Ocean paradise. The archipelago is 250 kilometers long. Only 1/5 of this is dry land, and much of that consists of small limestone islands thickly covered by trees. The islands support over 17,000 people, and many Palauans depend on the sea for their livelihood. Fortunately, the sea is highly productive. Palau is an archipelago set within a huge coral reef. Over millions of years, the waves and currents have sculpted the rock into an incredible natural maze of tunnels, caverns, and lakes. The marine life here is complex, varied, and impressive. Marine biologists are still finding new species here every year. Palau's coral reefs are known to provide breeding and feeding grounds for big fish that later spread far and wide throughout the Western Pacific. This is a spotted eagle ray. Palau has more species of marine organisms than any other group of tropical islands in Micronesia. The islands are close to the part of the Western Pacific that has the most varied marine life in the world. "77 species of small reef-inhabiting damselfish are found here. All reefs are natural hunting grounds for sharks, and Palau is no exception. "300 species of reef corals have so far been recorded in Palau. There are fewer than 80 similar corals in the entire Caribbean, and they've been thoroughly studied. Palau has more species of seagrass than any other islands in Micronesia. These are gorgonians and black corals that filter their food out of the water. One short dive gives some idea of the riches contained in this underwater Garden of Eden. Between 1947 and 1994, Palau was part of the United Nations Trust Territory of Micronesia, administered by the United States. Now it is a sovereign nation. The American presence has brought about some changes, but the sea and its bounties continue to dominate the lives of most of the islanders. Fortunately, even the conflict that involved Palau during World War II has had little lasting effect here. A few relics of the war remain, but most were claimed by the jungle or the waves years ago. Palau has an unrivaled network of lagoons that can only be reached through narrow channels at high tide. It has over 80 marine lakes, isolated from the sea by jungle-covered limestone hills. Some of the lakes are connected to the ocean by tunnels deep in the limestone. Others have no tunnels to the sea, but seawater seeps in through underwater cracks and fissures in the limestone. Scientists are still exploring and mapping the channels, lakes and lagoons. Palau's reefs are famous, but the marine lakes had rarely been visited until recently. Palau has been described as one large marine organism, of which reefs, lagoons and marine lakes are all living and breathing parts. Exploring the limestone lakes and the submerged channels that connect them is like potholing at sea. This dive was made to reach a subterranean chamber said to be largely filled with fresh or brackish water. Once past the entrance, the tunnel sloped downwards into the darkness at an angle of 40 degrees. A sea fish, proof that the water, at least at the start of the dive, was still salty. After a steep descent, the divers had to swim 20 meters vertically upwards to reach the hidden cavern. The temperature dropped sharply, and the water began to turn fresh where it had filtered through layers of limestone from the surface far above. The divers came upon ancient stalactites formed 15,000 years ago during a great ice age, when the surface of the sea was 30 meters lower than it is today. Like potholers, the divers surfaced in the hidden cavern.
Yeah, I think this was the underwater, the underground center here.
The next objective for the dive team was a small, completely isolated saltwater lake set deep in the jungle. The only way to reach it was through a long, unexplored channel that connected the lake with the open sea. The entrance was less than 2 meters wide, and the long, winding passage it led to even narrower. The attempt could only be made when the tide was slack. This would be a dangerous place to be caught with a heavy volume of water rushing through the tunnel. Filter-feeding organisms are evidence of the tidal flow. They need a constant movement of salt water to bring them their food. The mollusk, a species of cowrie, feeds on sponges and other marine invertebrates. Purposefully drifting mangrove leaf shows that the tide is beginning to flow. It's time to be pressing on. The arrival makes the claustrophobic journey seem completely worthwhile. Charles Darwin would have been fascinated by the evolution of life in these marine lakes. The jellyfish in each isolated lake differ in size and in the length of the stinging cells with which they feed and protect themselves. This one is poorly equipped, possibly because in this lake it has few enemies, and so seems to be able to survive with smaller defensive weapons, though the sting cells remain large enough for food gathering. Proof of the lake's connection with the sea are the delicate saltwater sponges and soft corals that grow on its slopes. Other marine treasures of Palau can be seen among the varied communities of its reef complex. There are barrier reefs, fringing reefs, and patch reefs, all seemingly different, but in reality, all part of one superorganism. That organism's cells are the many individual colonies of corals, mollusks, anemones, sea stars, crustaceans, and fish. The largest bivalve in the world, a giant clam. They can reach 250 kilograms in weight, but they don't trap divers by the legs, as legend suggests. A sea cucumber. Despite its appearance, it's a harmless plankton feeder. A nudibranch, or sea slug, a shellfish without a shell. The variety of creatures here is probably unmatched anywhere else in the world. Coral polyps, tube worms, sponges, and gorgonians are just a few of the beautiful creatures which abound here. These are crinoids, relatives of the starfish. They feed on plankton, but unlike corals, they can move around. Down amongst the tentacles of an anemone, a small fish lives, immune from the poisonous stings that paralyze and kill other fishes. It's a clownfish. There are many different species. They're highly colored, and they all possess the ability to live in a close embrace with anemones without getting stung to death. The clownfish wins protection from the anemone, The anemone's reward is that it collects scraps of food from the fish's meals. To protect itself, the clownfish secretes a transparent protein that discourages the anemone from firing its deadly stinging cells. Nearby, the divers find another combination, another species of fish living with another type of anemone. The clownfish constantly rubs shoulders with the anemone's tentacles. It needs to in order to stimulate production of its own protective coating. Another anemone has a similar mutually beneficial relationship with a small shrimp. The shrimp also has a strange alliance with the resident clownfish, which would normally eat it. Some anemones have been found housing about 20 anemone fish of 3 different species. That so many variations on the same theme should be found on one small section of the reef is entirely typical of Palau. The Palau archipelago, the islands and the seas which surround it, are aptly described as a Pacific paradise. The marine life around the islands is truly spectacular. Every year, marine biologists discover new species. Some of the marine lakes and underwater caverns have yet to be explored. The Sea of Eden has not revealed all its secrets yet.
Good evening, here is the canoes. Tomorrow at 7:30, Dwellers of the Deep profiles the first woman to round Cape Horn in